and welcome to Meeple University How to Play Catan, as well as its 5 and 6 player expansion. In Catan, players play the role of rival settlers on the island of Catan. Players attempt to earn victory points by building roads, settlements, cities and other buildings on the island. The first player to score 10 victory points wins the game. This is the board as set up for the base 2 to 4 player game. The 19 terrain hexes are placed randomly on the board and the 18 number chits are placed around on them, respecting the rule that red number chits cannot be placed adjacent to each other. I have also placed the harbour tokens randomly around the board, although you can use the printed harbours for the game. The robber token starts on the desert. To complete setup, in turn order, each player places one settlement and one road on the island. Settlements go on the corner of hex tiles, and the road goes along the edge of hex tiles and must connect to the settlement. Subsequent settlements cannot be placed adjacent to any existing settlement. All corners adjacent to that settlement must be empty. The road is not subject to this limitation. After each player has done this, each player adds another settlement and road to the board in reverse turn order. This settlement does not need to connect to the existing settlement. After placing the second settlement, the player takes one resource from each of the hexes adjacent to that settlement. So in this case, 2 ore from the mountains and 1 brick from this area. This concludes in reverse turn order until all players have 2 settlements on the map and a small starting hand of resources. Each player's turn takes place in 3 steps. The first is resource production. The player rolls the dice. I recommend rolling them away from the board because otherwise it can knock the pieces. And then look at the total number of the dice. Every hex with that number will then produce resources. There should be 2 hexes for every number except for 12 and 2. So in this case the number is 11. This hex will produce bricks for all players with a settlement adjacent to that hex. This hex will produce wool for all players with a settlement adjacent to that hex. So in this case, the orange player would take 1 brick and 1 wool, and the red player would take 1 brick. Later in the game, when players have built more settlements, the player will take 1 resource for each settlement on that hex. So here the orange player would take 2 wool. Later in the game, when settlements have been upgraded to cities, each city will produce 2 resources instead of 1, and so the red player will take a second brick. The second action on a player's turn is trade. A player may trade in one of 4 ways and may make as many or as few trades as desired on a turn. The first way to trade is directly with the bank. Trade 4 resources of the same type for any 1 resource of another type. Secondly, if a player has a settlement on a 3-to-1 question mark harbour, meaning a settlement on one of these 2 spaces with the jetty, the player may trade 3 of any 1 type of resource for any 1 other type of resource. Thirdly, if a player has a settlement or city on a 2-to-1 harbour, the player may trade 2 of the specific type of resource listed on that harbour for any 1 other resource. Finally, players may trade goods with each other. All players may be involved in negotiations, but only the player whose turn it is may be involved in a trade. The player may put up any number or any type of resources for trade, and may take or refuse any offer from any other player. The final step of a player's turn is building, in which players build roads, settlements, cities, and development cards by spending resources. A player may build as many times on his or her turn as he or she can afford. To build a road, players spend 1 wood and 1 brick resource. Take 1 road and place it on the island. Roads go on edges between hexes. They must connect to that player's existing roads, settlements, or cities, and they cannot occupy the same space as another player's road. To build a settlement, a player spends 1 grain, 1 wood, 1 brick, and 1 wool, and takes one of his or her settlements and places it on the map. As in setup, settlements go on the edge of hex terrains. They must be connected to an existing player's settlements or cities by roads, and they cannot be placed adjacent to that player's settlement or to another player's settlement. To build a city, the player spends 3 ore and 2 grain, takes a city token, and upgrades an existing settlement into that city. Cities cannot be built without upgrading it from an existing settlement. To build a development card, the player spends 1 ore, 1 grain, and 1 wool, and takes the top development card from the pack. The player looks at it, but keeps it hidden from other players. I'll talk more about the types of development cards later. The player cannot build something if he or she has run out of the corresponding token. However, remember that when upgrading a settlement into a city, the settlement token is returned to the player's supply. If during resource production a player rolls a 7, no hexes produce. Instead, any player who has more than 7 resource cards in hand must choose half of those cards, rounded down, to return to the bank. This produces a risk for stockpiling resources. Development cards do not count towards this limit. Then, the player whose turn it is moves the robber token to one other hex on the board. That player then steals 1 resource card at random from one player who has a settlement adjacent to the robber's hex. In this case, red could choose either orange or blue to steal from. Play then proceeds to trading and building as per a normal turn. As long as the robber is on a hex, that hex will not produce, even if its number were rolled. There are 3 types of development cards in the game: 6 progress cards, 14 night cards, and 5 victory point cards. At any time on any turn, but only once per turn, you may play a progress or night card from your collection. Victory point cards are revealed at the end of the game when claiming victory. Playing a progress card gives a player a bonus in resources or in building actions. If a player plays a night card, he or she moves the robber token in the same way that would have happened had a 7 been rolled in the production phase. The robber is moved to a different space, and the player who played the knight steals 1 random resource from one other player who has a settlement or city on that hex. Players' knight cards are played face up in front of them and stay there for the rest of the game. There are 2 bonus tokens, each of which is worth 2 victory points to the player that currently holds them. The first is Largest Army. Largest Army is given to the first player to play 3 knights. Other players may take the Largest Army token by exceeding the number of knights that this player has. Playing a 3rd knight would not exceed this player, and so Largest Army would not change hands, but if playing a 4th knight, the red player would take the Largest Army token. This other is Longest Road. Longest Road is given to the first player to make a continuous link of 5 roads on the board. Roads may be broken up by settlements, but they must be a continuous link of one colour. The longest road token may be taken by another player if that player exceeds the length of that player's roads. For example, blue placing these roads would make a continuous link of 7 versus 6, and longest road would change hands. At any given time, a player's number of victory points is equal to 1 point for each settlement on the board, 2 points for each city on the board, any bonuses for largest army or longest road, and 1 point for each victory point card in hand. If on a player's turn he or she has 10 victory points, reveal any victory point cards from hand and claim victory. Victory cannot be claimed on another player's turn. The 5 to 6 player expansion of Catan plays on a much larger island, with 30 hexes instead of 19. The expansion also comes with additional development cards and resource cards, although these are the same types of cards as the base game, just extra copies of them. Play in the 5 and 6 player game is almost the same as in the base game. On each player's turn, the dice are rolled, production occurs, and the player may trade and then build. There is then a special building phase in which each subsequent player in turn order may perform build actions. Players can only build with the resources they currently have. They may not trade for additional resources. And players may choose not to build if they wish. Players cannot play development cards during their special build phase, nor can they claim victory. Both of those must wait until the player's turn. This special build phase reduces the downtime between players' turns, and it also stops players from building up and then being robbed of all their resources before they've even had a chance to spend them. As in the base game, the first player to score 10 victory points on their turn wins the game.